Try again.
Got it.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that, being patient
And
with us there.
so, oh, I see. So yeah, so I've got to pause and stop. I assume that if I'm not clicking pause or stop, I'm probably recording.
Yes.
So, okay,
Good.
cool. The miracles of modern technology. All
Exactly.
right.
Well, so I invited Karen Wills here at the behest of Reverend Ashley Haran, who knows Karen well and knows that she knows quite a bit about healthcare. So I just kind of wanted to make a bit of an open forum here where we could just have a conversation. I think that Karen has a lot that she could just sort of offer by way of conversation, especially about the national healthcare world right now. And then I guess I'd like to go from there and maybe have some questions, chime in about the statewide scene, and let this conversation kind of play out naturally. So, Karen, if you wouldn't mind just kind of kicking us off, I'd love to hear
Can do
what you
that.
have to share.
Well, I would love to hear more also from anybody, particularly Rita. You had mentioned that you've had a negative. The ACA had failed you, and I'm hearing from some people who are sort of in similar shoes and are very disappointed with how the ACA had kicked in, and then other folks who have been tremendously helped by those changes. Who were being failed by pre-ACA healthcare. So a couple things. I have not met anyone anywhere who is claiming that the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act of 2000, that kicked in along about 2009, is anything close to perfect or ideal. And so, but um, as as most of you are probably familiar, what happened was that once upon a time, so prior to about 2008, 2009, we were in a kind of enormous crisis where healthcare costs were just exponentially moving completely out of control, and healthcare benefits were really, really low as compared to most places in the world, particularly, or sort of most Western countries. So we were covering fewer people, paying more, and getting less for the dollar than basically almost any other westernized country. And so the Affordable Care Act, some of the is essentially, people sort of forget, we refer to the ACA, but people forget that the actual core was not just affordable care, but patient protection. And we essentially had no patient protection in America. And a huge section of the ACA was supposed to be about protecting patients. And that's the part of the ACA that by and large actually has worked for us. So when you hear people talking about the benefits of the ACA, it's the PP that's left off the patient protection section where those benefits have been the most huge. And those were provisions like no lifetime caps, not allowing, essentially what it was intended to be, and the way that it was written was to be a lemon law. The lemon laws are like, if people can't, there are regulations about what people can say when they're trying to sell you a used car. They can't just flat out lie to you. They can't sell you crap that's going to break down the minute you drive off the lot. And the way that the ACA and patient protection was first written, it was supposed to be like that. And so there were essentially scams that the insurance companies had been running for a really long time, where they were selling people policies that were so obscure and so misleading that lots and lots of people were getting really ripped off. They were purchasing policies at high prices, completely unregulated pricing, with almost essentially unregulated rules. So people were buying policies where they really didn't know what it was that they were buying, or where they were paying for things that they thought were covered that weren't. There were very few rules federally. Some of the states individually actually had pretty good rules, and one of the things that's an issue in Minnesota is that Minnesota historically has had better regulatory rules than most other parts of the country. And so some of these patient protection benefits of the ACA had, in some ways, a little bit less of a huge impact in this state than they had elsewhere, because we were in a little bit less of a hole to begin with. We had some policies that actually were not that bad. But across the country, what was introduced for really the first time ever were rules that included things like there cannot be a lifetime cap on insurance coverage for a particular condition. So you can't max out your insurance if you have a devastating catastrophic illness. You cannot get to the point where you are going to be required to sell your home and sell everything you have and put yourself into bankruptcy, which was happening for thousands and thousands of people across the country. And that was part of the huge issue, was that people were going completely broke and losing everything, including losing their houses, in order to pay their medical bills, and having to, and the rate of bankruptcy was astronomical. Other provisions, like that students were able to stay on their parents' health care bill, or any person who did not have employer covered health care could stay on their parents' policy until the age of 26. As the parent of a 22-year-old who just got her first job, that was hugely helpful. She was covered all the way through college in a way that wouldn't have been possible necessarily. There were many policies that you would just drop out as soon as you turned 18 or turned 21. Your kid would not be covered under your employer's policy anymore. Another provision of the ACA that was really key was the idea that you had certain essential benefits. And so every insurance policy had to provide the set of essential benefits that included some health care for women, and regular checkups, pediatric care, and of course, very important to all the psychologists on the call, it also covered mental health care. So every insurance policy had a lower limit threshold of care that had to be covered. One of the most expensive things for the country nationally, and particularly for hospital emergency rooms, is people coming in unexpected, uncovered mental health crises. There was a law that was written and passed back in 2010 that was supposed to allow for parity. It meant that insurers couldn't make any rules that made it a whole lot harder for people to get coverage for mental health care than for physical health care. And so those rules had been written, but they never had any teeth. They weren't really part of any law until they were incorporated as essential benefits into the ACA. So when Affordable Care was written, those protections were supposed to be included, and the way that they were going to get paid for, just so the tail end that goes with that is the affordable piece. The affordable piece is that they were supposed to get paid for by essentially making sure that everybody in the country was signing up for healthcare, and that there would be all these healthy people as well as people with illnesses signed up and contributing proportionate to their incomes. And that there would be some federal monies to kind of support them to support that and to make it affordable for everybody.
Mm.
You see, Karen,
Yeah. So let me pause and go ahead.
this is Kay. Just
Yeah.
another really big protection. I don't know if everybody has the chat box off where I type this is
Oh,
that you
sorry.
can't refuse to accept anybody because of pre-existing conditions. That is just huge.
Huge, absolutely huge. Yeah, and so there were people who were being excluded from employer-covered insurance because they had or like my husband, they have asthma, or somebody had an episode of depression, had been hospitalized for a week with depression, and they would be considered a bad risk and uninsurable. I also, I don't know that I had overlap, but I'm a hospital psychologist at Children's Hospital. I work with kids who have cancer, and they are hugely at risk as adults for conditions that come about as a result of their cancer treatments. And so, essentially prior to the ACA, most of the children with whom I work would be considered completely uninsurable as adults. It wouldn't even be considered. So, I want to pause and just say hi to Nancy. I see you just were able to join us. You must have finished your piano teaching or piano lesson. Oh, you're still on mute. Okay. Do you want to say we had a chance to kind of introduce ourselves a little earlier and just sort of say our background, and your husband had mentioned that you had been working as a speech pathologist with the school system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did some Medicaid billing for some of the students.
Yeah, with the third party billing thing. Yeah.
That probably will affect some of those, some income for the schools. It wasn't a cost to the families, but right. It was income for the school.
That's fascinating. I do a lot. So as a hospital psychologist, as a neuropsychologist at Children's, my work involves evaluating kids and then going into the schools and helping the schools to kind of create a game plan, helping them to understand the impact of the medical condition on the kids' development, and helping schools to kind of create a plan. And one of the things, if I understand that what you're referring to, is that Minnesota has a law that says that so let's say one of my kids had a brain tumor that knocked out their speech skills for a while. Their speech and language therapy that they would need critically to be able to recuperate would be paid for in Minnesota under Medicaid if the kid had that insurance, and then gets picked up by the school districts if Medicaid can't cover it or if the parent refuses. Yeah. Most of our kids get that, by that third-party payment, and so that's actually, I had not thought about that. So that's
my understanding of how it worked.
No, that's exactly, so basically, what happened with affordable care in Minnesota is that there was a pool of money. The federal government had this pool of money that people refer to as the exchange, and states had the option to either buy into the exchange or not, right? Minnesota went whole hog to have sort of the maximum possible access to public money to help pay for healthcare. I mean, Minnesota has had this presumption until very recently that healthcare was kind of a human right. And so the idea was, we already, before the ACA came up, we were already in relatively good shape. We made a rule in Minnesota many, many years ago that healthcare in Minnesota had to be not-for-profit. You couldn't have for-profit healthcare companies selling insurance in this state. Because of the fact that, obviously, if you're a for-profit healthcare company, you have you're concerned about your clients that you're insuring, and you're concerned about your shareholders that you're making money for. So in its infinite wisdom, our current legislature just repealed that. So we now are open to, and that's already become part of our law, that we can now have for-profit health insurers in Minnesota. Actually, that was passed in the House. I'm not sure if that's cleared the Senate yet.
Dayton would have to approve it.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah, it hasn't. Yeah, the whole. I'm not sure if it's cleared the Senate, and I know none of this has been signed because it's all. Most of the changing healthcare rules are still part of the omnibus bill that's still in committee. They line up the House version and then they line up the Senate version and try to kind of make a match, and then they have to pass it on the Senate floor, and then Dayton has to sign it. So everything right now is in that side by side, checking it out and making the rules match kind of thing. Going forward, so I also have an eye on the clock. I realize it's getting late already. But the reason for talking about all those ACA changes is that those were all new things, and they were huge patient protections that were correcting abuses and gaps in the insurance coverage system. And they were supposed to have been paid for by having a huge risk pool, basically everybody in the country was supposed to be paying in at a level that more or less was matching their incomes. We already had Medicare, which was a similar system, but it only kicks in when you're 65 and older. That's our public, our universal public payer healthcare system is Medicare. We had a universal public payer healthcare system if you're very, very poor, if your income's very low. And then Minnesota had this sort of, so you think about the very low income as kind of the bottom of the layer cake. That was already there, and it was sort of federally funded as Medicaid. Minnesota built in this Minnesota Care system, which is Minnesota Medicaid, and we had a layer of money that we accepted from the federal government that was actually funding people up to almost, sort of middle income people. And that also was available in theory to fund everybody who did not have employer coverage. So people who were artists or writers or certain kinds of students, were supposed to have been able to be covered. But what failed was not the patient protection part, but the affordable part. There was a process that was set up where you were supposed to be able to sign up with an insurer. There were 7 of them to start out with, and then because of the funding problems, because they weren't getting paid enough to cover their costs, more and more and more of them progressively dropped out. In some cases, that was a selfish thing. They wanted to make more money than many people think they really need to be making. But a big part of it also was that they legit did not get the kinds of funding supports and subsidies that they were supposed to have gotten, because what happened was that the ACA, the bill got passed, and then a critically important piece of the funding for that would have made things affordable was slashed. And it was kind of like a midnight repeal. And that all happened back in the end of 2010 or the beginning of 2011. So the funding structure for the Affordable Care Act was killed at birth, basically. I mean, it was sort of dead on arrival, and there was no possible way without that funding, so without the subsidy piece, that it could have succeeded. So it didn't. It did, a lot of people, I don't know exactly what Rita's situation was, but a lot of people sort of got stuck in a situation where the care coverage became unaffordable instead of, and that's why, and Dayton made that remark, that it wasn't affordable, and it cost um, the little tweak that nobody even noticed in the ACA subsidies was hugely impactful, and so it's left us in a place now where essentially what's going on is that the federal legislature has proposed this AHCA, the so-called American Healthcare Act, that was is essentially, as Andy Slavitt said, a tax cut. And it, right now, what's being proposed is they want to take away all of the essential benefits. So any insurance company can sell you anything that they want. They can tell you almost anything that they want. And there is no requirement that any individual purchase healthcare of any kind. So you now have like no risk pool of healthy people. You don't have, the healthcare works the same way as property insurance, right? You need to have people paying in and paying for like car insurance or property insurance that have not yet wrecked their car. You have to have people paying for housing insurance whose house is not on fire. So if you make a rule that the people who, like, the only people that have to pay for insurance are people that just had a crash or their house is burning now, that doesn't work. It really doesn't work. And so there's a fundamental disconnect in what insurance is about. And what we hear people like Paul Ryan saying is, why should I have to pay insurance? I'm not sick. Why should I have to pay for pregnancy? I don't have a uterus. And some are saying, why should I have to pay for people's vasectomy? I don't have a vas deferens. Those voices are often, not as loud. So there is some fundamental confusion right now. What's happening with the healthcare currently is in Minnesota is two kinds of things. One is we have John Marty, who has a really interesting website called the Minnesota Health Plan, mnhealthplan.org. And I'll put some links together. My day job blew up, and so I didn't do a lot of homework for this, but there are some great references to look at. Some of the best ones. John Marty's plan, which he has been bringing up year after year after year for a very long time, has to do with the idea of universal single-payer health care. And he has a little book about it out now. It's the mnhealthplan.org. And you can get his book for free. It's a very, very interesting thing to read. He lays out the arguments in favor of universal single-payer health care in a beautiful way. And so if you're interested in healthcare, it's well worth reading. And it has an ice cube's chance in hell of actually going anywhere within the next, unless there are massive, massive changes in the legislature. So it's not going to pass, but it's sort of like the ideal world. It's the beloved city that everybody wants to kind of know about. It's a very good thing to know about. Minnesota right now is kind of in a situation of trying to keep as much of what we already have as possible. What's on the table is essentially gutting not only the affordability idea, what made everybody mad was the idea that everyone should pay for healthcare, whether or not they're sick, and whether or not they think they're ever going to get sick. That you shouldn't get to gamble based on being a healthy 23-year-old, say. Because of the fact that if you lose your bet, I'm paying for you, right? It's not your gamble. Your gamble is on me because you're going to be in my emergency room and my taxes will be paying for you. So, and that's not fair. So, so when we think about having these conversations, the idea of that's being argued is that you should have the individual freedom to decline being insured, even if we build in a kind of insurance that makes it possible for everybody to be insured in an affordable fashion, right? So the issues are, no individual should be overburdened with healthcare premiums that they can't afford. Every individual should be adequately protected from buying scam insurance that doesn't really cover what you think it's going to cover. Nobody should be paying premiums and then going bankrupt. Everybody should be covered. Healthcare should be a universal human right. That is not a point of view with which everybody agrees these days. But it's becoming more and more and more the zeitgeist, regardless of political party. It's an interesting thing. That people should have the freedom from catastrophic illness. People should have, and that we as a society should have the freedom from having to pay huge amounts of money for other people's catastrophic illnesses because of the fact that they didn't have adequate coverage. And so then are coming into the emergency room to get their basic care for their kids' vaccinations or their asthma, and humongous bills. And then the third piece of that package that nobody in this current administration is talking about at all, as far as I can tell, well, as far as friend Andy Slavitt's the one who said this, and he knows way more than me, is healthcare costs. And so you have this triangle of access, coverage, and costs, and what hospitals are billing, what clinics are billing, and very importantly, what insurers are billing. So our very own Al Franken, sorry, I'm being political. Al Franken wrote a special provision into the Affordable Care Act, and Al's provision said, if I'm like Optum or whoever, Anthem Healthcare, and I'm selling you insurance, I am required to make sure that 80% of what you pay goes to coverage, goes to insuring people. I do not get to take 50% of what you're paying me and jack my CEO salaries up so high that we're going to have our annual meeting in Jamaica. We don't get to do that under the current law. That is one of many pieces of the current law that this current administration and legislature is looking to repeal. So right now what's on the table is the idea of repealing all of the essential benefits. Any cap or regulation, they don't like the word regulation. So any regulation that would limit the or structure the ways in which insurance companies are allowed to use your money that you're paying. Any provisions under the ACA for transparency, where you can kind of get the idea that you can go online and relatively easily compare 5 or 6 different plans and choose among them if you're on the public option, that would be repealed. Essentially the call is to completely repeal and do away with 100% of these provisions that I've been describing. I mean, so there's a strong cadre of the current legislature that really wants to just get rid of it, just wipe it out, really go back to how we had it before, where the health insurance is sold as a completely free market commodity. Every insurance company has the privilege of doing whatever they want, and it's on us as consumers to kind of figure out which is the best, to kind of shop around, and and good luck to us being able to sort of sort all that out. There's a group in the mostly Republican legislature called the Freedom Caucus, which is kind of the farthest right group of Republicans, and that's really what they're saying they want, as I understand it. There are some more moderate people from both parties, kind of the more centrist group, is saying no. We want to deregulate insurers. We don't want to have rules about what they can do. We want the free market just to operate, and the best insurance will win. But we do like some of these patient protections because we know that Americans are like crazy about them, which is mostly the making sure that they cannot exclude people based on pre-existing conditions. There's some talk about not allowing a lifetime cap because it was causing so many bankruptcies, and that's expensive for banks and such. So they kind of didn't want that. So different people are arguing about different kinds of things. The pre-existing conditions one, and the thing about keeping your kids on your insurance until they're 26, those are relatively popular. So even people like my guy Eric Paulson is saying, who pretty much is pretty far right most of the time. He's saying no, we're not gonna do away with those things. But he's under a lot of pressure from this other faction to say, yeah, we want to do away with all of it. And meanwhile, what's happening is that you have a bunch of other people who are saying, no, we really, this was a huge advance. We finally have created a healthcare system in the United States that's kind of more like what Europeans have. It's making people healthier. It's integrating mental health with behavioral health, which has never really happened before. It is providing for coverage that people really need and want. And what we need to do is to switch some stuff around to capture the affordability piece. What failed was not the protections. That was important, and we don't want to lose it. What failed was the affordability. And the affordability pieces failed mostly because there was never an adequately healthy risk pool, and there was never the federal subsidy piece, because the Republicans in the legislature under Obama slashed that 5 years ago. So it never happened. So that maybe to TMI. I don't know if that's useful or
this
not.
is so useful, Karen. I think this was a really good overview. I wanted to pause before we kind of transition into the next thing, just to see if what's been talked about so far is causing questions in people, if we need any more clarity about what's already been covered, or if there's little things people want to add in this moment, knowing that we want to save some time to kind of get into the more legislative piece and what kind of concrete action steps there are.
What can we do?
Yeah. So any questions right now, just kind of about what's already been covered, or maybe little things or insights to add right now?
I threw my stuff onto the chat.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you, Kay.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to mention that if I understand correctly, though, while we're talking about this at a federal level, and you mentioned things about Minnesota, and I've only just moved to Minnesota from Texas, insurance companies are regulated by state. And so the story is different by each state.
It is.
And I was actually going to ask, Karen, you mentioned that, I forget how it's worded now, in Minnesota, health insurance companies it can't be for profit. And I was wondering how many other states is that the case in?
Yeah, I do not know for sure. It is I know back when I was a few years back when I was first when MNsure first kicked in, it was fewer than half. So
Okay.
it was it was kind of more rare than not. Does anybody else familiar with that? Yeah,
But it
was.
sounds like Texas might not be in that boat.
Oh no, Texas wouldn't. No.
Texas, if you get an insurance license, you learn this and this and this and this, except in Texas. This and this and this and this, except in Texas. This and that, yeah.
Wow.
Texas is different.
I just want to mention to Rita, it sounds like maybe you retired early and so you're living off retirement income. And if that is the case, there is a workaround that will let you get on MNsure, MNcare/MNsure. It's kind of the same here in Minnesota. By living off Roth IRA income, which is not taxable, if you live off that, then basically it looks to Minnesota tax people like you're not getting any income and you get to live and you get to get insurance on the MNsure system.
Thank you. I'll have to look into that the next time. I just moved to Minnesota in April, so I'm pretty new. But Texas is one of those states that didn't take the Medicaid expansion. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, its insurance was rocky, limited. So
they do that as soon as possible, because pretty soon I think Trump's going to get things changed, and then probably Minnesota won't be able to even offer what I just mentioned. But that is a workaround that retired non-65 people who aren't yet 65 can use.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is I'm finding that there are more and more people that I talk to, they're in my situation, who we would have loved to have bought insurance. Yeah. But there's a point at which you can choose to buy the insurance and sit home on your couch because you can't afford to do anything else, or you decide to self-insure and live a life, and it's unfortunate. And in Texas, again, as I said, it was different than here. Yeah. So it didn't matter if I was out of the state, the insurance didn't cover me anyway. So when I traveled, I wasn't covered. And so I needed to stay home and sit on my couch and pay $700 a month. And that just wasn't going to happen. So anyway, but that's Texas, and we're talking about Minnesota. Yeah. Let's go back.
Any other questions or comments?
I did want to say, I was just looking up to see whether there are other states, and it says that did get passed. That's been signed by Dayton already. Then they were trying to solve the problem with the individual people getting insurance through the individual pool, and they were trying to fix that. And it's law, so we don't have it now, and we're the only state that didn't have it. So nobody has it now. That has. So if that was clear, that we now it's permissible in Minnesota for for-profit insurance companies, and no other state has that prohibition. So that's where we are right now. Sorry.
No, that's disappointing, but not surprising. Disappointing, but not surprising, I was going to say. Yeah.
Well, so now at this point, Karen, I'm curious to kind of hear about, the legislation that's still kind of in the works. I know you talked about quite a few different legislative plans here in Minnesota. And other just sort of, I guess, ways. I'm curious, you mentioned this before about a few issues now becoming pretty bipartisan. To unpack a little bit more what that looks like and what you see as the future, being the prognosticator that we are making you right now. Help guide us through, the next few months and what our place in it might be.
A couple things. one is, I mean, clearly, like this is preaching to the choir, but one is very clearly to be able to think about healthcare as a social justice issue. I mean, we know that these changes that are happening are hugely impacting lower income people, people of color, people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses, and people like myself who are I just turned 60 years old, so I've got another 5 years before I have any chance, as a person who doesn't have severe disabilities, but I'm not going to be Medicare eligible for a few years yet. And I'm in an age group where, under the currently proposed federal legislation, my healthcare premiums, if I were not employed. So if I were to leave Children's and go into private practice, something that I've been very actively thinking about doing because I thought I would be covered by the ACA. But if they go forward with the proposed bills, my premiums as somebody who's 60 years old would be 5 times higher than the premiums for an equivalently healthy person who happens to be 25 years old, just because of the fact that it's all based on my risk of getting sick, which of course at 60 is much higher. And so it's all based on, kind of sort of how bad your body is, and until you turn 65, at which point they can no longer consider that because you're no longer part of the open market, you're fair game, which so that's disheartening. But it's just so in terms of the things that are proposed right now and what to do about them, one of the things that is really ironic is that the current approval rate for the provisions of the ACA is 55%. That is higher than it has ever been, because probably in part because a lot of people are beginning to understand what it is. And there still are thousands of people, when they go out and poll folks, who say, I hate Obamacare. Obamacare sucks. Obama was horrible and Obamacare was horrible. But the ACA, I mean, many of them are saying, I hate Obamacare, but I love the ACA. And other people are saying, I hate Obamacare, but I'd be for Romney Care, which is like the ACA was, sort of a version of something that Mitt Romney came up with. It's a Republican healthcare plan. It was never really a Democratic plan. It was sort of an unhappy compromise with a lot of people who sort of like the idea of private health insurance, which most Democrats, by and large, didn't care for all that much. And so the bipartisan thing, part of this is that people are sort of moving towards the concept of that healthcare is a right, rather than something that we ought to have to appreciate as luxury. That healthcare isn't something that can be marketed in quite the same way as like a TV or a car, and because one really can't do without it. There really is no substitute for having health care, and there really is no way that people can actually afford it. So part of it is people are beginning gradually to sort of understand that having some kind of universal health coverage is inevitable, either on the grounds that it is a right, and that freedom from suffering, freedom from pain, freedom from ill health, freedom from preventable death, that these are fundamental freedoms that Americans are willing to kind of fight for and really stand up for. So those become kind of more bipartisan arguments. The other thing is that most folks really do understand that there's a certain logic to insurance that requires all of us who are not yet in pain to buy into it, you know, the burning house argument. The other thing is that we have an aging population of white people, and it's aging white people who mostly vote. I mean, you know, I look at, you know, Jack's not included, you're a young white person, but the rest of us who are white people, probably, I'm guessing, at least over 40, we vote. And we are a powerful voting bloc. And none of us is getting any younger, so God willing, we're all going to get old. And as we do, we will have disabilities. We will have health issues because that's part of the package. And so we all want that. We want to get older. We want to develop those health issues that come with being older. You know, we at least got to have, you know, glasses and cavities fixed and all those kinds of things. Whether or not we get hip replacements, you know, or heart valve surgery is another thing. But it's this sense of the inevitability of aging, that we will all have at least mild disabilities at some point, and they have to be covered, because if they're not, we go back to the good old days of losing our houses. And so these are the kinds of arguments that have bipartisan power. Now, full disclosure, and I know, you know, Moose Jaw's a nonpartisan organization, but you know, you have to, I mean, full disclosure, my own background is that I'm very, very active in the DFL party. I'm a very active Democrat. And so you should take everything that I'm saying with a 50-pound bag of salt. I'm trying to not, you know, I mean, I'm trying to be fair and not be inaccurate in how I'm presenting what I understand about the current legislation, but I clearly am viewing that through my Democrat lens, and so I just want to be, you know, open about that. And but in my experience of talking with friends of mine who are Republicans or Libertarians or Socialist Workers Party or Green Party people who hate the Democrats, the arguments about fairness and sharing, and that we're all responsible for one another, and we are all part of the interconnected web of human existence, without which the world falls apart. That's the faith basis, both of my choosing the Democrats to kind of hang with, and of the way that I think about healthcare. But it's a total loser when it comes to talking to a lot of, say, Trump voters about why we should not be supporting this American healthcare plan. So far, the Trump administration and my own representative, Eric Paulson, who's talking about essentially repealing the ACA, and has tried to do that, you know, 59 times now. Their whole thing has to do with personal responsibility, that we should be personally responsible for taking care of ourselves. And if we do that, we won't get sick. And, you know, if we get sick, it's kind of on us. You know, if we have a kid with a disability, it's kind of on that kid's family. And why should other people have to pay for that? And so, I mean, this is literally what people are saying. And it's very, so, okay, so what can we do? One of the things that I do think we need to be doing is reading George Lakoff and understanding. If you haven't talked about that already, that needs to be a whole other convening call. You have to, have you guys already done that? But Lakoff? Okay, all right, you have to, so there are psychologists, including George Lakoff, Lakoff, who have written about the differences in mindset of people who tend to be more conservative thinkers versus more progressive thinkers, and take a point of view and understanding those two mindsets of kind of the focus on personal responsibility, and that if stuff happens to you, it's on you. You kind of dig yourself out, or you call your friends, or you set up a what do you call it, GoFundMe account. It's ruggedly individualistic. It's based on kind of like the pioneer spirit of people, kind of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And then when you're in trouble, you call on your neighbors, and if you've been a good neighbor, your neighbors will come and help you, right? So it's kind of this pioneer sort of thing. Versus, more of a communalistic, an idea that we're all here for each other, that we have to be here for each other sort of all the time. And that no man is an island, what happens to one affects all of us, and that kind of thing. Now, I told you already I grew up as a UU, right? So I have that stuck in my head. It's very, very difficult for me to think in a way that isn't sarcastic about this other point of view. And I get that I'm not quite there. It's hard. But it is important to understand that there are these two kinds of perspectives, and I think George Lakoff does as good a job of anybody about describing them in a way that is dispassionate and useful and interesting. And the bottom line is that when we're talking about healthcare, the other thing that he argues is that when you're talking with people about preserving patient protections as well as affordability, about the idea that it is not okay to throw patient protection under the bus in the interest of affordability. And it is not okay to throw affordability under the bus in the interest of deregulation and the free market for insurance companies. And then it damn well is, I'm just going to get political, I can't help it. It is not okay to completely gut a system of health insurance that is fundamentally based on the concept that health is a human, health care is a human right. And health care is a societal necessity. And that the deregulation of the free market for insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies in any way ought to be allowed to trump that. So those perspectives are coming from fundamentally different ideological mindsets. And Lakoff actually cites some neuroscience research. I have problems with this as a neuropsychologist, but there is some research to suggest that there may actually be some differences in brain wiring. And Lakoff cites some of the neuroscience research, which is comparing the brain wiring of people who think more communally and in terms of the good of society, in contrast to the people who tend to think individualistically in terms of the good of the that 23-year-old who just really doesn't want to be paying, damn it, I want my $500 a month or whatever my health insurance is going to cost me, and and I shouldn't have to pay that because I don't feel bad. So understanding, so that's a very long-winded way of saying that one of the ways to understanding those differences in mindsets and where they're coming from is huge. Now, that's the airplane level. The nitty-gritty level is the people to pay attention to who are smart and Minnesotan and freaking brilliant, in my humble opinion, that I'm trying to learn from about this stuff. One is a guy called David Zafran at Take Action Minnesota. Take Action Minnesota is the most active healthcare focused social justice organization currently. Now, Take Action Minnesota, as you probably know, does a bunch of different things. They were huge with Minnesotans United and other stuff that many of us worked on.
Yeah.
But the Take Action Minnesota website has like different tabs on it that they're working on, and their healthcare section is just fantastic. They have a newsletter that you can sign up for if you're on email that goes out, I believe, weekly. And they are, and if you're on Facebook, we set up a Facebook page. David and myself and some other people set up a page called Cure Not Chaos.
Take Action Minnesota, Karen, has a phone call like this tomorrow night at 6:30.
Oh, okay. I hadn't seen that. That's great. And so David's our friend. In terms of what's going on currently with the Minnesota State Legislature, David probably knows more than just about anybody about, because I mean, it's his day job. He gets to do it full time. Yeah. So that is something definitely to check out. The other thing is, you want to follow, if you're on Twitter or if you, I kind of repost almost all this stuff to my Facebook page. You can look at my Facebook page, but also if you're on Twitter, Andy Slavitt, which is spelled S as in Sam, Lavitt. Sorry, I can't talk it. Thank you. So Andy Slavitt is the guy who lives in Edina, and we'll be doing various talks. Those will be also posted. David would post those out. He was the head. He was essentially the head of Obamacare. He's basically the guy who was like the brains behind writing the ACA, and he was Obama's Medicaid and Medicare guy. What they're talking about doing right now, they being the current federal legislature and then the legislature of the Minnesota houses, the feds are talking about basically killing the ACA completely, and not only going back to what we had in the olden days before the ACA, where the insurance companies pretty much get to do what they want except for state regulation, which is why it is so important who is the state auditor of the state of Minnesota. It's critically, that state auditor's office, which is probably going to be up for re-election in 2018. So one thing we can do for healthcare is to make darn sure that we elect a state auditor who is an ethical person who cares about the societal good rather than just the individual good when those are in conflict. And so that's one thing. So in Minnesota, all of our insurance regulations are, kind of run out of that office and then run by the governor's office. And it used to be that we would have this pool of money for low-income people, which is Medicaid. Now, Medicaid is under the gun now. And so we're talking about going back to something that is not what we had before the ACA, but is actually less than what we had before the ACA. That what they're talking about doing is creating a system of block grants so that every state gets a certain amount of federal Medicaid money based on the state population and based on what each state spends for its Medicaid eligible population. Medicaid pays for 25% of the mental health care in this country. Almost 50%, over a little bit more than 50% of all pediatric care. And the thing that most folks don't know, and that is incredibly important to tell every senior person that you know that doesn't vote for Democrats, is, or that thinks that public health care is a bad thing, regardless of who they vote for, is that Medicaid is what pays for long-term nursing home care. And most people don't know that. They think that if you are in long-term care, that you're covered by that gets paid for by your Medicare. It does not. It does not. So Medicaid, the amount of money that the state has under Medicaid, has to cover poor people, people my age, sort of middle-aged people with severe disabilities. So if I had, say, AIDS, or certain kinds of like severe cerebral palsy or spina bifida, I might be covered by Medicaid. Lou Gehrig's disease, you automatically get covered by Medicaid, no matter of your age. So it pays for certain extremely severe, extremely disabling chronic illnesses. But it also pays for something like 70% of the cost of long-term care. If you're in a nursing home or a long-term care facility, regardless of your age, even if you're over 65, it's Medicaid. And so if the state gets a pot of money, each state gets a certain amount of money, especially in a state like Minnesota, where we have good, efficient healthcare, so we don't spend as much for our Medicaid people because we don't have for-profit healthcare, and so our healthcare is a little bit less expensive here than it is in, say, Texas. It just becomes outrageously expensive, and our Medicaid pot is just not going to go very far. So there's no way, Jose, that kids in school are going to get their speech therapy paid for under Medicaid anymore, because that money isn't going to be there. People are, and what will happen is that they'll start cutting services. So we need to be following, take action, look at what David is doing. He's great. It's his full-time job, and he will be calling for actions. I've been reposting those to Moose Jaw. We need to be following Andy Slavitt and learning from him about what's happening, and essentially keeping track of who is on those committees. One of the things I'm trying to do right now is to make sure that people contact the folks on the convening committee, and I can send you the names and the places where they live. All of them are from Greater Minnesota, every single one. They are right now lining up those bills, and essentially what we need to be saying is we basically want to keep keep those as much as we can of the Minnesota coverage for that we have under the Medicaid expansion. Governor Dayton has a whole plan in place that's pretty detailed. There are 63 bills right now that may become part of the omnibus bill, but essentially having that relatively vague ask of saying, let's not lose the kind of quality healthcare that we've had, and let's, keep on making sure that we're seeing healthcare not as a luxury, but as a social necessity. I think that's the message they need to hear, because the nitty-gritty details will get worked out.
I could listen to you all night because
I know I was getting late.
So incredible. But I just wanted to add that the reason that those legislators are from rural Minnesota is because our healthcare system is crashing. If Moose Jaw is looking for a disadvantaged population in terms of health, it's not in the cities, except maybe Center City, I don't know. It's from rural Minnesota, where our hospitals are closing at an incredible rate. Our nursing homes are closing at an incredible rate. So are the medical practices. And the second thing is that in order for Medicaid to pay for your nursing home care, by the way, your spouse must be impoverished. You must have less than $20,000 worth of assets to live on for that year. A healthy spouse living on that, hey, I mean, this is just not a good deal.
Wow. Yeah, we have so much to still learn, I'm sure, but I feel like we've all gotten a really good start. For the sake of time, and since we're at the end of our meeting, I guess I'm really curious to check back in with all of you and just maybe taking a minute just to sit together in some silence, and then maybe just share a word or phrase or a lesson you've learned from today that you are going to take with you as you continue to, or first start to, advocate for a better healthcare system. So let's just take a minute to breathe together and then kind of go around this proverbial circle to share something we've learned tonight.
So what I've learned, this is Susan, is really the emphasis, and this is the way I've felt all along, that healthcare is a right, but that it is a right. And as Karen said, it's freedom from suffering, freedom from preventable death, freedom from preventable disabilities, on and on and on. And if you help people look at it that way, that it's freedom from these things, maybe that will make sense to some people who don't believe that it's a right. I mean, to me, it's like food. You can't live without food. And if something happens to you, you can't live without health care. So I'm going to keep that in my mind.
For me, it's universal health care. We really need it. I lived near Canada where we could occasionally access it, like with my boyfriend when I was up there or something like that. It's incredible and much lower cost. And in this medical industrial complex that we're dealing with down here is just such a crazy system. So universal health care, folks.
I found the concept of, is health a luxury or is it a necessity? A good thing to think about, and when you talk to people, I've found that very helpful.
Well, for me, now that I live in greater Minnesota, I guess I'd better figure out who my state legislators are, and we need to have some conversations.
I think for me, Karen, you said a few things about the very just different mindsets people bring in, depending on what kind of side on the political spectrum they're coming in on. And that idea of, is healthcare, is this a system that people are contributing to that helps all? Is it just this like rugged individual, like take care of yourself? And in my mind, I went right to like the example of just like roads, like not everyone utilizes roads in the same way. And yet it's kind of part of like what's in the water here in our society, what we've contributed to for a more efficient, healthy, life as we know it system. And I'm hoping that healthcare becomes one of those things. And I see potential that we're at like a watershed moment, but I'm not sure if we'll get there or not. But just knowing that a few things like the pre-existing conditions and lifetime caps are maybe now part of the new zeitgeist, that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, this is a reminder to me of why I try to avoid this kind of conversation late at night, because I get so frustrated and so angry as you talk about these things. And I know that people have different mindsets and that I need to try to understand that, but I just feel so angry most of the time that the rest of you and your positive takeaways and you're continuing to work on this, it's inspiring, and I shall try, that you set a good example. But I'm just telling you, I won't, this is being recorded, so I'm not going to say what I'm thinking, but anyway, thank you all for being more positive than I am feeling.
I have to thank you, Jane, for voicing that. So True Confessions, right? And this is being recorded, but whatever. I meant to be at the Science March. I wanted to be at the Science March. I spent the entire weekend pretty much binge watching 2.5 seasons of Orange is the New Black, which is this really, really angry show. Fantastic show if you haven't seen it, but it's raunchy and angry and completely off any topic that I'm currently working on except for prison justice. It's about women in prison and their lives. And so, which is sort of so much worse than anything that I'm dealing with right now, that it was really great to do that. But I would say the other thing that we do need to do is occasionally, that might not be what would work for everybody. You might want to go hiking or go to a spa or get a nice massage instead. But you do what you have to do, and I think that there are times when you get so intensely involved in the work of trying to make the world better that sometimes you have to just kick back and appreciate the beauty of what is. I actually do, in fact, kick back and appreciate the kind of healthcare that we have in Minnesota and most of the people and the history of comparatively decent healthcare and comparatively decent legislators and legislation everywhere. We are still comparatively really lucky in a lot of ways. Particularly white people in Minnesota are. So it's a thing, and there's a lot to be grateful for, and I'm also really grateful for the fact that I had the privilege to check out for the whole entire weekend and watch TV. So there you are. Sometimes you just have to do that.
Exactly. Oh, well, what a great conversation. Just so you all know, if anybody wants to save any information that's in this chat box, you have to do it before you leave the meeting. Otherwise, it just does disappear. So there is a function to hit more and save chat. So you can kind of go through that information later on your own. But other than that, thank you so much for being here. And next month, tune in. We'll have the final convening call of the church year. So you'll be getting news about that soon.
Okay, leave it up a bit back then, because everybody, you can copy, do the copy save thing very easily too on one of your other documents. Just highlight it and hit Control E and then hit your other document, Control S. So I've been doing that throughout.
Awesome. And then Karen, just so you know, my recording did actually stop working about 10 minutes ago.
Oh, okay.
So once we close out of the meeting, you'll have an option to save the recording into your computer. So if you could just find that file and send it to me, that would be awesome, because I could splice them together then. I'll be posting this video in the Moose Jaw YouTube channel.
Very cool. Okay, yeah, great. I can do that. If it's we'll figure it out. If it's too big of a file, I can do that. And
you can do Dropbox.
And actually, you may have stuff planned, but either if not, or maybe for something as a future thing. Seriously, if you guys haven't actually talked about this already, I can put you in touch with a guy who is a super expert who's been teaching me about this Lakoff stuff.
Oh, yeah.
George Green, and he happens to be a UU. Yay!
Oh, awesome.
So that would be really great to try to get George, because he's just freaking brilliant, and he really gets that stuff. And I think it is being able to sort of have that in your head as a model for sort of thinking about how to craft your messages when you're talking to people who think really differently is a super useful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that tip, Karen.
Yeah.
Well, be well, everybody.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Yeah.
This was fun. I learned, and I learned that I still seriously need to work on being succinct, but what can you do? So thank you.
No, you did great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.